Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. In each episode of this podcast, we chat with energy experts from all around the world. We exchange on timely energy issues as well on their life experience. You will learn a lot, whether you are an energy aficionado or a newbie. And one of my favorite parts of the podcast is when guests share about their personal trajectories. I always find it authentic and inspiring. It's October 29, 2020, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today, I'm exchanging with Amos Hochstein, a businessman and former diplomat at the U.S. State Department, where he served as a special envoy for international energy affairs during the Obama administration. Hi, Amos.
Hi, how are you? It's great to be
Good. Very good to hear your voice, and thank you for joining the Energy Vista podcast. So we'll exchange today about different topics, but especially the approaching U.S. elections. We are 5 days away now, and high on the agenda is going to be energy transition, especially if the Democrat nominee Joe Biden gets in. So we'll delve into that, and then we'll discuss also your personal and professional trajectory. So I feel that if Joe Biden is elected, the Democratic administration is going to see many of the world through a new lens, and this is a lens of climate change, whether it's geopolitics, migration issue, economic growth, climate change, energy transition are going to be at the heart of many policies. Do you agree with this view of the world?
Yes, I think without a doubt, when we're sitting a few days, as you said, a few days away from the election, one of the biggest differences between a Trump administration and a potential Biden administration is going to be that climate change is not going to be any longer a topic just reserved for environmentalists or climate geeks or energy aficionados. Climate change will move towards the center of U.S. policy, both domestically and towards its foreign policy. And that means that it's not only going to be viewed through the lens of climate and energy, but rather through everything that we do. So when you look at our budget priorities, when you look at the U.S. spending priorities and policies across the board from workers' rights and unions to social justice issues, to investment in highways, to our broader economy, climate change will be either a center or a tangential issue in all of those things. And the same can be said in foreign policy, where we will have a new frame in foreign policy where climate change is no longer the topic that you raise but you don't really promote. It becomes one of the top 3 national security goals in our discussions with other countries. That sounds like easy rhetoric. That part, the foreign policy part, is the hardest thing to do, because there are significant challenges that Biden will face as president with certain countries. And how do you fit in the climate issue into the immediate and short-term crises that we are facing in those regions or with those countries? That is not easy to do.
Yeah. And also, can the State Department be as efficient when it prioritizes, discussions around climate with a geopolitical rival, if it puts at the heart of the discussions climate versus, human rights or military built-up in the South China Sea? I mean, if you think about China, is it going to be more complicated to have geopolitics and climate together than having them on separate tracks?
That's exactly the right question to ask. So if we deal with China and we have to deal with, and on the agenda, we're inheriting a relationship that is at its worst that it has been in 30, 40 years. And now we have to deal with the South China Sea and the East China Sea. and North Korea and cyber and Huawei and 5G. And we also have, in the other bucket, we have Hong Kong and the threats to Taiwan and the decline in personal freedoms in China, and the threat towards an expansionist China with the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Mm-hmm. So we have all these tough issues. And that's before we start talking about tariffs and trade imbalance. Now we have to also talk about climate. And if China is willing to work with us on climate, but you have to choose which part are you going to compromise on. We're not going to get what we want on everything. We're going to stand up for everything, and we're going to fight for all these issues. But realistically speaking, how do you manage putting climate in that priority list at the top when the military is very focused on the Chinese expansion capabilities, when the Homeland Security and the intelligence community is concerned about some things, and the human rights groups are concerned about others? How do you balance that? That is difficult because I've worked, for secretaries of state, for the vice president when he was the vice president, for the president. Every secretary of state I've worked for used to say economic policy is foreign policy, but few of them actually then follow up with spending their own personal time addressing economic issues. So this, because it's difficult to fit it in. Yeah. So this now will be a challenge. But I believe that Joe Biden will fit into a broader context where that's what other governments are starting to already do. So it won't happen on day one, but I believe we're going to make significant progress towards climate change being in that center of discussion.
Yeah. And to continue on China, does China really need the US to tell Beijing what to do on climate change? It seems that they agree on the trajectory and at least on the rhetoric. They just committed to becoming climate neutral by 2060. There may not be that much persuasions to do from the US government around China and climate.
Well, let me start answering that question by saying that I think that I laud and I'm very happy with the Chinese commitments for 2060. But I'm not, count me a skeptic on some of the nature of the commitment. It's not that I don't believe that that's what they will do in China. If they put their minds to it, they have the resources to do it for sure. But a couple of major concerns there. One, the 2060 goal is, their approach to it is back loaded, meaning that they expect to do most of the progress later towards 2040, 50, 60. But the more concerning part for me is that China comes to the issue of climate change not from a global climate change viewpoint, but rather from a clean air, clean water, clean environment in China. And what that means is that while they are still, while they're transitioning and investing in renewable and clean tech inside China, they are still providing cheap capital to across the world, and especially in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, for coal exports from China, for coal power plants, and for other infrastructure projects that are entirely inconsistent with these goals. So it's good for me to have a cleaner China, but it comes right now, I think that it comes at the expense of other things. So what does that mean? The United States is not in a place to tell China what to do on climate. That's not what we're here to talk about. I think the conversation with China is really going to be about, let's work together, join me, and have in global leadership. And if we can have the United States, the EU, China, India, and perhaps a couple of countries in Africa, the Middle East, and South America, now we'll have leadership that's balanced, but that covers, just the United States, Europe, China, and India covers a significant portion of the world's population. Mm-hmm. And if we can say, let's come together for a Paris 2.0, and we will be the anchors, then we won't have this situation where countries or regions are doing things in their own boundaries, but not contributing to the other. And that's where the conversation with China gets complicated. Are they willing to make the same commitment that they made inside China and make it applicable to their Belt and Road Initiative? Are they willing to make that applicable for the AIIB, their infrastructure fund, where they will no longer fund any coal projects at all? I don't know the answer to that. So far, I can tell you that right now, they're going in the opposite direction.
Yeah. So talking about coal is cheap, and energy in general is a cost for our economies. How do we make sure that the transition is thoughtfully designed and paced so that it doesn't increase, exorbitantly our cost of energy? Or maybe, citizens in wealthy nations, especially, are already, ready to pay actually for a higher cost to consume green energy. Like sometimes I feel like we didn't get this debate actually in our societies about who is going to pay for this extra cost, this premium for greener energy. And down the line, we may have some issues around that.
This is the issue that I am most focused on and most energetic about. This exact issue. I think we're facing, if we don't change some of our attitudes, and when I say we, I mean people who support climate change and want to see aggressive action. If we don't change our attitudes, we are going to have a real crisis on our hands that is exacerbated by COVID. And let's start with the good news, bad news. The good news, when I started the Obama administration, right, so let's say 2010, coal was 50% of power generation in the United States. When I left the Obama administration in early 2017, we celebrated the fact that coal was now below 30%. That was a huge drop in a very short period of time. In 5 years, we went from 50% to 28%.
Thanks to abundant and cheap gas.
That's correct. It was largely overwhelmingly, 80-90% of that was because of a transition from coal to gas, because gas was cheaper. And I'll get to that point because that's the core of your question. But if you look today, 4 years after Donald Trump came into power promising to increase coal is at 12% of power generation in the United States, meaning that renewables in the United States, which are also around 12%, have exceeded coal for the first time. But gas is still the dominant, right? But that's huge. We went from 50% to roughly 10% in 8 years, 9 years. That's incredible. That's the good news. The bad news, on a global stage, we haven't made a dent. Coal has not declined all that much. It's declined, but not all that much. It's roughly the same. So that's the challenge. Now in comes the core of your question, and that is money and cost. In Europe, there is a long tradition of paying for energy at high levels. Gasoline in Europe has always been significantly more expensive than in the United States, and significantly more expensive than the entire developing world, where such costs as electricity, heating and fuel, gasoline, petrol, significantly is subsidized. Mm-hmm. So now we don't have a tradition outside of Europe of people being willing to pay higher prices. When gasoline prices are very high in the United States, people buy more efficient cars. The minute gasoline prices go down, meaning even oil prices go down, what do we see first rising in the US? The sale of pickup trucks and SUVs. So very price sensitive. So what we need to do in a Biden administration, what I would hope that they would do, is that we're going to accelerate the transition by reducing, not by trying to take down fossil fuels, but rather, because that doesn't work and takes a long time, but rather by incentivizing the switch. By providing, well, it's fairly easy. One, you give tax credits and rebates on electric vehicles and hybrids, and significant ones. If you do that, people will buy them. Number two, do what Vice President Biden is proposing, which is ensure that federal funds are building out the charging stations across the country. We have electric vehicles only at 2%, maybe even a little less than 2% penetration in the United States. We talk a lot about them, but if you leave the East and West Coast, you don't see very many of them. So electric vehicles need to be affordable and on par with others, but they also have to have ubiquitous charging stations. I need to know that wherever I go, I'll be able to charge my car. I won't get stuck.
Yeah. So who is paying for the infrastructure of the refueling
The government
station?
should do that. The government should do that because this is the gap that the private sector won't do. It's not economically feasible to expect that they will do it. And if we do that, it'll take forever. We can jump that gap of 10 years by the federal government using highway money to say to any state, if you want highway dollars from the government, you need to make sure that for every X miles of road, there is Y charging stations. But we need the private sector, the industry, to come up. We need to have better charging. It cannot take 20, 30 minutes to go to fill up your car, quote unquote. You have to charge your car from 0 to full in 10 minutes. So we need to have the car to be high quality, which I think we've already achieved. We have to have it affordable on par with gasoline cars, which I think we're getting there, but with the rebates we can do much better. And we have to make it user-friendly for someone who's not buying a car for ideological reasons, but for practical reasons. Right. If we do that, we can have an acceleration. But here comes the crisis point. All of this what I'm suggesting can come on a stimulus, a $2 trillion stimulus that I expect we're going to have in the United States, which is matched by, after the elections, for sure, matched by $1 trillion that the Europeans are doing. But okay, so China, the United States, and Europe can have stimulus money that accelerates the transition. What about the rest of the world? And my fear is that I'm seeing in the developing world, they look at us and they say, you guys are crazy. You think that we can do all these things, that we can spend billions of dollars on energy transition. We don't have the money. And this was true, Leslie, 9 months ago. But today it's much worse because COVID has depleted the funds from national governments, central banks, local states. They don't have the money anymore. Many developing countries rely on tourism, which is gone. Rely on small manufacturing, which has been depleted. On supply chains that are troubled. And that they've had to spend additional funds on hospitals and PPEs and masks and ventilators. And now, when we come to the world for Paris 2.0, for a climate summit that President Biden wants to do, President Biden, if he's elected, wants to do, and we're going to ask them to make these sacrifices, they're all sacrificed out. What we need urgently is for Europe to stop talking about spending €1 trillion inside Europe. We need to spend a significant portion of that and of US money and through the IMF and the World Bank and the ADB and the regional development banks like the ADB and the IDB and AFDB. Yeah. And we need the nonprofit sector to come in the Gates Foundations and so on to the tune of billions of dollars. And we need to have all of them working together with major banks and private equity funds.
Yeah,
and
so I was going to ask, Yeah. Do you see more financing investments going into renewable energy?
Well, I think in the United States and Europe, yes. Right now, I think there's very little money, relatively speaking, going into renewable energy and green tech because because energy is a bad bet for money right now. It's hard to make money. Even in renewables, it's hard to make money. And traditional energy players are used to seeing double-digit returns on their investment. Right now in renewables, you get in the single digits if you're lucky. So we need to change that. But still, money's going to come because the government now, especially if Biden's elected, the government is going to be tipping the scales and spending public money in this sector, which means that the private sector money, private equity, hedge funds, banks, will come in and invest on top of that because they're going to be leveraging the cheaper money that's coming in. And they will make money off of that. That's fine. In Europe, probably a similar story, maybe even better. The problem is that when you go to other countries where we need it, whether it's India with 1.5 billion people, or Bangladesh or Pakistan or Nigeria or Ghana, or even in Central America, the banks and the funds, the private money, doesn't want to finance renewable energy for a simple reason. These countries tend to be non-investment grade, so the risk of investment is way too high. Nobody's willing to provide the guarantees because the governments in these countries they themselves are not investment grade, so they can't provide that. And in many cases, there's no legal structures. The democracy may not be so strong. The courts may not be so strong. So therefore, it's very hard to put that money in. I think there are solutions to this. I think the focus of the next Biden administration should be less about or not only about what the government's doing, but how do I bring in the banks? And I'll tell you, during the Obama administration, I chaired something called the U.S.-India Renewable Energy Finance Task Force. And we did that because after Paris, the Indians made a big commitment on renewable energy, but no private banks were willing to finance it. They weren't willing to touch it for all the reasons I just described. So we brought together the minister from the Indian side and myself, who co-chaired it. We brought the public money, the private money. But one of the bank CEOs told me, Amos, I'm not going to put a single dollar into renewable energy in India until there's a change to the law structure, the legal structure, to the fact that some of the generation companies are bankrupt. I don't know that I can make a return. So I think we can have the IMF and the World Bank and some of its other international institutions, the EBRD, the IFC, step in and provide that guarantee, provide that credit, so that the banks in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere will be willing to make investments and will be willing to finance big renewable projects. But without that, we will have a terrible divide of the Western world that is climate and the rest of the world resenting us. I already heard a minister say that our climate push by Europe and the United States is green colonialism. It's because we're trying to force them to do something that is good for next generation, but is going to bankrupt them today. We can't have that.
Good. Well, many things to implement, right? If Joe Biden is elected.
Yes.
So that's a good segue to your personal and professional trajectory. So Amos, you mentioned several times your years under the Obama administration as a top diplomat and energy leader. It seems that when you work for the government, it's a life experience, but sometimes it can also stretch you physically, emotionally. Can you tell us a little bit about your time in the government?
Sure. So first, I had a number of stints in government, and I worked in Congress and I worked in the administration. I will say there is nothing that I've done in my life that was as rewarding as working on energy issues, on foreign policy, national security of energy in the Obama administration. Those years I cherish those years. But they come at a cost. Those are early morning to late night. I was traveling probably 3 weeks out of every 5 weeks I was out of the country. I had young children. There's a lot of sacrifices that you have to go through. But in the long run, I've never looked back with regret. I missed a lot of games and concerts and seeing my children grow up. But the sense of the sense that you have contributed something to the world, that you've made a difference, the public service is incredible. And there's an irony in the United States around working in government. It is longer hours, less flexible, less self-control about your schedule, more time away, less pay, and yet this is what we like to do.
Yeah.
So it's ironic that the higher paying jobs take a lot less time. You can go into the private sector and make more money doing a lot less, and yet the satisfaction of doing something for the world, of looking at your children in the eye and saying, I did something that will make things better for your life. Mm-hmm. You can't replace that.
Yeah. And talking about your children, do you sometimes think, well, they are going to be a generation even more aware than ours regarding climate change and global warming? Do you think about your legacy and what you want them to think you did during your professional years?
100%. And we're now in this changeover that we talked about at the beginning, where climate change has gone from a back seat to a front seat. And that really happened in the last 10 years, and even maybe in the last 6 years. And my children, they think this is obvious, that we need to spend less, and that we need to emit less, and that we need to take care of a planet that it's in danger. They look at the fires and the hurricanes and the crazy weather patterns, and they see it. They don't understand how people can have a discussion about the question mark. Is this all connected? They see it as obvious. They don't see a question mark about why we have solar panels on my roof at home, and why we do all these different things in our personal life to try to conserve. So I need to be able to look at my children and say to them, honestly, I did my best. And what I thought was the most rational. And sometimes that's difficult, because I believe that the energy transition is really, the word transition means that it doesn't flip a switch. Yep. And there are some who question my attitude and my perspective on how the transition happens. And I sometimes have to explain that to my children, of why I worked for a few years in natural gas. Because of the belief that there was no transition from coal to renewables. The transition was coal to gas, and now hopefully it will be gas to renewables over the next 20 years, 10 years, 20 years. So, but these are, I think about that a lot.
Mm. And so you mentioned your years at Tellurian, which is a company that is advancing the Driftwood LNG project. Can you tell us a little bit about your years there? And I have to tell you something. I was once at a conference in Europe, and there were some people supporting the Nord Stream 2 project. So not really a big fan of Driftwood LNG and other US LNG export projects. And, they were having this conversation that so many people from the US government, from the Department of Energy or State Department, are working for, the private sector is advancing and selling US gas abroad. And that it undermines the argument that not, associated with the government. What do you think about this?
I'll answer the second question first. On Nord Stream 2 and so on. I agree with them. When I was in government, I opposed Nord Stream 2, which is the Russian project to build a new offshore pipeline from Russia to Europe, because I did not believe it was a commercial project. It had political interests in order to bypass Ukraine, to bankrupt the country of Ukraine. It wanted to maintain and stretch its use of energy as a leverage tool, specifically in Eastern Europe, to achieve political goals. That's why I opposed it. And Vice President Biden opposed it strongly, probably the strongest voice in the U.S. government opposing it at the time. But I kept saying, wherever I went, I don't care if you buy American LNG or Qatari LNG or Australian LNG, or if you buy LNG at all. All I care is that every country in Europe will have a diversified infrastructure and give yourself choices and options. I don't even care if you buy 100% of your natural gas from Russia. That's fine with me. If you can get a good price, get a good price. But don't build one pipe that goes from your country to Russia. Right. Because that is the problem. And I can tell you there are several countries in Europe where they do not have any other option. Now, I think the situation has changed from 2015-16 to today. The infrastructure has changed. There are more options. Yeah. But we're still not all the way there. Yeah. I agree. When the Trump administration came in and opposed Nord Stream 2 and said, you must buy American LNG, it undermines it. Now you sound like Russia. I never said that. And even when I worked for Tellurian, trying to sell LNG from the United States, I didn't sell geopolitics. I was saying, okay, the Russians are offering you $2 or whatever it is, X formula. I'm willing to offer you less. If you get a better price from them, buy it from them. Mm-hmm. I think what changed the dynamic in the world, why American LNG changed the dynamic across the world, because the prices came down. We forget today that we are dealing in $5 natural gas prices, $6. That just a few years ago it was 18 and 20 in Asia. Yes. Mm-hmm. And 12, 13 in Europe. That means that households and countries on heating in the winter are spending half or a third of what they spent before. Mm-hmm. It also means that when gas is so much cheaper, the ability to build new infrastructure becomes more advantageous. And that, if you're incentivized to build new infrastructure, you're also freeing yourself from your one supplier with one route. Yeah. So I agree with the criticism. I hate what the Trump administration has done. They've ruined the argument. They've turned us into Russia. If we're simply saying don't buy Russian gas, buy American gas, well, we're the same. They say don't buy foreign gas, buy Russian gas. I wanted freedom for Europe from one supplier, and I couldn't care less who they buy it from. And I still don't care if they buy it from America or buy it from Norway. Mm-hmm. It's fine. And again, I'm okay with a country like Lithuania that has an LNG terminal for them to buy 100% of their gas from Russia. Because if Russia turns off the gas in order to put pressure on them, mm-hmm. they have an option. Mm-hmm. I just want everybody to have options. Yeah. And when I look at what's happening in Bangladesh today, and in India and in China, I am confirmed with my decision of why I went to work for a natural gas company. Mm-hmm. Because, folks, there was no chance that would simply go from coal all the way to renewables. We need to do what we did in the United States. Yeah. And that is to get rid of coal. I'm happy. Yeah, I'm happy to hear you mentioning the word gas, because those days I feel that with many Democrats it's a dirty word and they prefer not to even to mention it. They know it will be used. There will be a role for gas, but it's a dirty secret. It is a dirty word today. I'm sad about that, because I think that we're on a transition. I can say that oil is a dirty word too, and I hope we stop using oil. But the reality is it's not going to happen tomorrow. Even if I can deploy more renewable energy because oil doesn't compete with renewables. It competes with electric vehicles because 60% of crude oil is used for vehicles. But also it's used for plastic, not just for the straw that we have figured out how to use differently without straws, right? But also for the entire interior of these cars are made of petroleum products. So I hope that I'm not a scientist and I don't know how to come up with hard plastic alternatives and so on. I'm sure they're there and I'm sure they're currently more expensive and that's the issue. But on natural gas, it's different. I don't think we're going to have natural gas for the next 100 years. Or even 50. But I do think that for now, gas is significantly cleaner than coal. And if we allow natural gas prices to go back to $20 or $15, the response is not going to be, okay, let's build more renewables. It's going to be, let's go back to coal. And we see that in India during Corona. When natural gas prices plummeted, natural gas use in India went up and coal was idled because it was competitive. But if natural gas prices go up significantly, then it's going to have to be government policy changing it. And the same thing in China. They're building much more renewables and they're building the base load of gas. So I hope gas trajectory is strong in the short and medium term, and then it'll start declining. And that's what I believe will happen. Yeah. Gas is not with us forever. It's not the solution, but it is the transition period. Right. And I don't think, but by the way, I think we've built enough LNG capacity. If I joined the Biden administration ever, if I was advising them, I would tell them, you don't need to approve new LNG facilities in the U.S. It's not necessary. We have enough. We don't need to extend new infrastructure from here on out. But we need all we need to do is focus on incentivizing the renewables, incentivizing the greening of the grid, and the market will do it. If we tip the scales by putting policies that restrict flaring, that restrict methane, and require and put a price on carbon, that will do it. People will then say, okay, let's compete. Yeah. And eventually gas will be less competitive. But is that going to be true in India right now? No. That's not going to be true in India. And that's not going to be true in Bangladesh. And I say Bangladesh, and I gave a speech somewhere, an American said to me, why do you focus on Bangladesh and Pakistan? I said, well, Bangladesh and Pakistan combined are larger than the United States. And who's building big, large-scale renewable projects there? No one. No money, no credit, no infrastructure, poor grid. So we have to see, we can't just focus on the rich countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, Amos, that was a great discussion. And just to conclude, I was wondering, you mentioned several times, potentially advising the Biden administration. Do you see yourself going back to join the government at one point?
I don't know. I've served for several years. I was happy with my service then. I'm now only focused on trying to make sure that he gets elected. And I think he has great people around him and they'll be able to do a great job for him. If they ask for my advice, I will give it. I think they also, they'll probably get my advice whether they ask for it or not.
Very good. Great. Well, thank you so much. And good luck for your next adventure.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks. That concludes our Energy Vista podcast, which was recorded on October 29, 2020. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.